Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. And for my members of SFO Continuity, welcome as well. Today, Dynastic family member discusses biggest threats to family offices. It features a longtime friend and acquaintance of mine who's a very private man. So as I mentioned, it's quite a privilege to have him on. His name is Jim Blom, single family office and multifamily office corporate development. Jim assists CIOs, SFO and MFO CEOs, and their founders with many things relative to strategic thinking, venture and private equity investments, and including selecting emerging managers. Jim, I've known you for a long time. It's great to finally have you on my program.
It's a privilege, Angela. Thank you so much.
You're very kind. And I did promise my audience, because I have many, many questions for you, that I would really get right to it very quickly. So without further ado, why don't get right to some of the really hard stuff? In my opinion, a great society is only built when the most gifted contribute. Is the West forcing equal outcomes, what I deem to be a lack of meritocracy, and as a result, pushing what I deem to be, and I think many others, a socialist agenda?
So, Angela, what I would say is I will leave it to our educators who are doing a remarkable job at educating, everyone across America, and especially I'll give a North American view on this. I think it's fair to say that for everyone who's over 50, we grew up in a society where you matured through society based on your education and what you learned, and whether that was at the enterprise and the workplace, or that was at the educational institution and that advanced education that you decided to go and embark on. It really came down to your ability to apply knowledge and then use that knowledge to build great value for your employers or for yourself if you were an entrepreneur. And so the real question is the right framework today? Where is higher education in evolving people's knowledge and their intelligence? And what I would say on a positive note, there's no question that the society at whole and at large has more access than it's ever had, which is extraordinary. The negative part is that we're trying to bring in government into what is traditionally an education system that over the last 200 years started at the home, and that moved into the municipality and moved through the states. And now at a federal level, the kind of legislation and policy that is being enacted, and more top down instead of bottom up, it's not producing the kind of outcome that I think we all want, which is the best and the brightest work harder to bring more and more people who are really, really remarkably talented, or they're really very ambitious and they want to have access to the best education. And that's the beauty and promise of AI. And when you apply AI to educational capabilities and in every manner of that institution called education, higher and an upskilling, if you just go to where we are today, we want to see more and more people have access, but access to the most advanced materials that they can get and acquire on their own, or through self-directed assistance, which I think that balance is not there the way it used to be. And so many governments want the corporations to be, the place of higher learning, and they want to dictate a policy that for them makes a lot of sense based on the workforce that they want to attract. But I think, quite frankly, society wants to go back to a system which is based on merit, as opposed to what is being regulated from a government and a federal level. So that's my perspective.
I wish I could answer that question the way that you do, Jim. You are very poetic and eloquent, and I always do appreciate that. Does political authority, and this is a vague question because I want you to answer it how you happen to hear it. Does political authority put an infinity of stupid checks on art? Sure, but also simply on intellect, which relates to my first question.
Let me think about that. Well, here's how I would address it. I would simply say that if you look at the United States and where the economy is built, every political part of our country would agree that small businesses across the country in every state that map into every fabric part of our society, at the end of the day, um, those small businesses and small business owners who are entrepreneurs, we just used to call them small business people, but now they're very entrepreneurial and they're using technology to scale. They employ most of the people in our country. So my statement back to you, to your question, is simply the government now thinks that they need to be involved in shepherding, stewarding, and governing that process, when in actuality, that was always a process that was done in the home. So the greatest wealth creator and the largest aggregator of capital now are family offices. And family offices all started with a small business that was started in the home. And over multiple generations in time, that aggregation of capital and shall we say that experience and adaptability and the ability to embrace risk and then manage risk and then mitigate against risks, those families and their partners did very, very well at actually building great societal outcomes. And so that is the engine of the United States of America, which is why the country was such an attractive place for everybody from the rest of the world to come to, because you had that opportunity and it was equal. And you had an equal opportunity, like many of us, especially my family and your family. We immigrated to this country. We didn't come with very, very much. And most of the people that are probably paying attention to what we're talking about are self-made, or there was a self-directed business that they decided to start, and they didn't need the government to actually help them do that. And that's the greatest economic engine that we have. And now in the last 15 years, there's more wealth with family offices that are being redirected into every facet of the economy. And what I would say is that concentration shows that that proves out to be a very viable, strong economic engine. And we're talking close to $10 trillion, which is larger than the hedge fund industry, based on what CNBC was quoting, I think, 24 hours ago. So
Wonderful in theory. However, why don't egalitarian societies work? Equality does not win wars. Equality doesn't build great economies. That one is somewhat per perspective of myself. Please.
Yeah, it's heavily debated, and a lot of people use the word fair and fairness. And what I would say is everybody around all of us across the country want it to be more fair for more people across their communities, given how diverse those communities are. So I'm happy to dial in here from California. The diversity here is extraordinary. And everybody in California is very proud of that, I would say. The challenge is there are so many new groups of constituents and stakeholders that it's hard, and back to your comment about democracy, it's hard to get everyone to move in one direction. For instance, in California, we don't have enough housing. Is that fair? No, it's not fair. Should we have more housing? Absolutely. Does everybody want more housing for everybody? Absolutely, because housing is a huge growth segment of the country. And when you build housing, the economy flourishes. So the reality, though, is no system can ever be perfectly fair and perfectly equal, and for the equity to be there that people want. So whether it's equality or equity, these are great theoretical constructs of perfect systems that have never existed. And I think, is the system getting more fair? In terms of access, yes. In terms of opportunity, maybe less so. But I think from a broader global perspective, California is a great example. It attracted the best and the brightest from all over the world. And now we have a tech industry. And now it's, we're in between because people have optionality. They can go back all over the world to Europe and Asia and India and Indonesia and have a remarkable opportunity. And you can go anywhere with your business today, which is incredible. However, is it equal and fair and equitable? And I think that most people need to realize that that perfect world doesn't exist, and it just has to be, re-engineered and re-architected. And I think we're struggling with that balance, especially in the West, and especially in the United States, and then in California, it's a major challenge.
In today's world with big tech and media, and I look at certain industries or communities, academia, media that I mentioned, Hollywood, big tech, rather bluntly, simply by looking at the charitable contributions via academia or the country, and obviously the movies being produced, those industries, which are very influential to billions of people, skew to being left leaning, what some would define as woke. I could argue, okay, perhaps other communities like military and others skew to being more the opposite side, although I think that pendulum has actually swung a bit as well. What I'm saying is when one side has power, and I would say this if it was the other way around, I promise, when it's
Sure.
not balanced, when one side has more of an edge or an advantage than the other, they, I don't see that going in a good direction. It doesn't end well. What do you think? And do you see the pendulum switching over a little bit?
What I would say is, let's go back to context. History picks the winners. I think everyone would agree with that. And so the question is how long will today's winners continue to win? So I'm in California. Overwhelmingly, it's a Democratic state. It wasn't always that way, but now it is, and it has been for some time. And I would say that now it's a question of diversity of opinion within that very broad platform of the Democratic Party and the DNC in California and the leadership in California. And what I would say is, if you took one view, which is the view of the majority of the population, especially in Northern California, which is where I am right now, they would say that this winning is great, and they would like to keep on winning. However, what they've also realized is the reality of their policy is now impacting them equally, and they're very divided about that equality that they see. So, for instance, if you're a resident of San Francisco, there's no resident in San Francisco who will say it's going great. They'll debate about what's wrong and who's responsible, but generally they struggle to look at things realistically, which is when Europeans and everybody from all over Asia comes to San Francisco, which they historically love. It's not the same city it was. So what's happened and what's changed? And what's changed is the policies have changed. And so that over calibration on the policy, I think, is swinging back because the stakeholders, the people who live there, have decided, you know what, we love our city, we love our community, we love our values, but we may have forgotten that in order to have the kind of society that we enjoyed and we wanted to make better, we've lost sight of some basic things that are required. And the one word I would use, which I use all the time, is security and safety still matter, because most people believe in waking up in the morning and being able to do what they want to do without being threatened with losing their life or their homes or any of their valuables, or having their family and their elderly, their parents and their children, threatened in any way. And I think that's the beauty of America. It's always been a safe and secure country. It's taken a long time, but as a result, in California, it's less safe than it used to be. So now they're going to have to recalibrate. And so that just means they're going to have to get really, really good at, shall we say, being very less binary and more focused on each policy and how it cascades across the rest of the ecosystem and the fabric of the communities that are interstitched and interwoven in a city like San Francisco, in an area called the Bay Area, which is very complex and very diverse and very different stakeholders with different desires, and multi-generational, and very, very much a very young city and a very old city. And so that kind of complexity is very challenging if you come from either side, whether it's libertarian or what I would say the opposite of libertarian is, which some have described as woke. You could say that it's very socially democratic, which is what my 16-year-old daughter says. So,
Well, on that note, speaking of the young ones, but before I quite get to that, audience, this is going to be another Angelo long form interview. Jim is incredible, very intellectual, much more thoughtful than me, and much more careful in a good way. And I have lots of questions, including on the economy and investing and his global perspective, including on the rise of technologies like AI on many things, is going to be very insightful. So lots of different core themes to cover. Just be a little patient. Uh, on the subject indirectly that you brought up, I could position it this way, and I'm going to be a little tactical and careful how I say it. To a growing percentage of the public, does the state fill a void of protector and security blanket in exchange for freedom for, to me, sadly, a growing percentage of the population?
Sure. I think the state's always had a huge, I mean, if you just look at history, the state matters immensely. The question is the balance between a centralized and decentralized, format for the state, and how it directs and controls and distributes power. And I think, I'll just use the state of California as a great example. The state of California is very, very, very important to the world's economy. It is very connected to the Americas and extremely connected. It's part of, I would say, greater Asia. So it's not Asia Pacific. It's not even, what I would call, the construct of a capitalist system. It is now in business with states and sovereign states that have a completely different type of economical construct and political construct. And so when you look at where we are, the state is going to naturally, if one of the largest economies in the world, and I'll let all the economists tell me where California is now on every level from a financial perspective, but let's just say it's one of the top 10 most important economies in the world. I think that's a fair statement. Many Californians will tell you it's much better than that, much more important. But let's say it's in the top 10. And if it is in the top 10, then the trillions of dollars that the state is stewarding and responsible for, that state is going to want to acquire more of that economic benefit. And you're seeing that in our tax policies, and you're seeing at the state and local level. And so that's why the tax system is set up the way it is. And the state is providing more and more services. And so because the state is very much, shall we say, leaning to the state having more power over every aspect of the economy, the state is dictating policy more directly to every single individual and every single community and every single, town in California. And that's what people are seeing, and you're seeing people react to that. And what they're realizing is, you may leave California and you may have a tax benefit, and you may have many other benefits, politically, faith-based, wherever your, the reasons for leaving. But a lot of people are realizing they love that lifestyle, and they come back. So you're seeing this go. People are going back and forth and realizing there is no perfect place. But in California, I would say, as a state, it's one of the strongest states in the country. Has a very strong position on its share of the economics and the value and wealth and distribution and equality. And so I think you just can see that if you're in business like California is in business with Asia, those states are less democratic. I'll just say it that way. And as a result, you're just going to start to embody the policies of your economic partners. And so that's getting distributed. And I think California is a great example of that distribution and concentration of power.
Very interesting way to put it, and perspective. I'm going to quote from George Orwell, then ask a question based on that. The most effective way, he stated, to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history.
Sure.
I could look at decadence makes us grow weak, and new factions, quote unquote, take over. Is this happening in Europe?
I will leave it to the Europeans to answer that. I will say that being a student of literature, the author and what he has published has been very instructional for most people to see what can go very wrong and what can go very well. And I think Orwell's view and the time and context with which he published his works, and some of his best writing, really gives you a full view that things can be, the filter and the aperture with which you see things and what becomes real can be the opposite, and vice versa. So I think to your question, really, where is Europe? Europe is going through another existential moment where that writing can be very, very valuable in giving you a sense of where you are from a compass perspective. And I think that's one of the challenges is that view that was espoused came about at a time which was very, very dark in Europe's history. And I think most European societies and most politicians and their people, I'm very proud of Europe. My family's European as well as American. And I can just say that I think there's been quite an evolution since the author's works. And I think now that they have to take a look again on where they are, and Europe may have rotated to what I would say a less ideal situation.
And building upon that, is
Yeah.
Europe doomed by its demographics, by lack of more standards in immigration, by lack of an entrepreneurial spirit, and inherently a growing, in my opinion, a woke laden culture? And I guess this builds upon my last question. Is it too late? Now, I'm lumping in multiple countries that make up Europe into the vernacular of
I was just gonna
broadly
say,
Europe. So I'm
yeah.
assuming there's nuances here. But as someone who has that cultural heritage and travels there frequently, what are you seeing? And where might I be overstating things a bit?
Well, I think it's very clear that no matter which country, I think it's very helpful to pick each country and then look at the country versus where it is with Brussels. And I think that's a great way to look at things. And the number one thing I would say, which is magnificent about Europe, are its institutions and its history and its experience and wisdom that it has. And that depth of understanding of time and really looking things in a 100, 200, 300 year perspective, as opposed to a quarter, a year, 5 year, 10 year perspective. Europe tends to balance itself out. The challenge is there are all the things we've seen in history, which is war and chaos and all the geopolitical events that are very, very troubling if you want to have resiliency and you want to have continuity. And so I would say that now Europe is becoming more diverse, and there are huge advantages to that. And you see that in certain countries in the Nordics, but you also see when they've overbalanced and gone the other way too far, that the society is pushing back. And I think that's the balance. And I think Europe is out of balance right now. I think it's just a factual statement. And people need to realize that these communities, you have to have integration. And I think integration has always been the key, and that's what you always required. And so I'm just going to use France because I love France. The French people are very, very consistent about speaking French, and thank goodness they are. And look at that incredible history, and what a great nation. Germany, until very recently, you had to be fluent in German. And so fluency, not just language and literate fluency, but literally full fluency across the culture. You need to embed yourself in that society and embrace your own culture and your own faith and your own perspective as a family, and then also that of the community you live in, and then the country you are in. And I think because the integration has happened so fast, because the immigration has happened so fast, that integration has not happened. And so there are societies who are not meant to be just tossed together. And I think that's the challenge, is the speed and change. And speed and change for humanity never gone very well. So, people are struggling with change in general, technology change, climate change, economic changes, currency change. Like, so many different changes have happened so fast that many groups across the world and many countries and their people are struggling with those changes at scale. And that takes a lot of time to process. And I think, quite frankly, many of the centralized approaches, especially from Brussels, if you're an entrepreneur, you probably would pick many other regions around the world to be an entrepreneur. And so, and what you can see how the Nordics really did a great job of adopting the best of both worlds. And we've seen that. And there's a lot to be applauded there. And then there is a Swedish model, and there's a Nordic model, and then there's, the renaissance we've seen across Asia, and entrepreneurs have been rewarded. And I think Europe has that opportunity to attract the best talent in the world, just like the US and China have been, and now India. And India represents this incredible, remarkable moment in history. And I think for the next 200 years, you're just going to see that region, the Indo-Pacific, really thrive and do incredibly well. And that's because of all the, shall we say, all the learning and lessons that society is very focused on, and what makes them so successful: meritocracy, education, family, their beliefs, their community. You have to, everybody there is like on the same program, very differently, very personally, very customized. But if you're going to thrive in India, you better adopt everything about that country that's beautiful and remarkable and stood the test of time of thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the same in China. So the fact that the US and Europe thinks that they can fix humans to be better at adopting change and adopting everybody from everywhere else, that's just not something humans are very good at. So, I think the world's evolving, so I'm very excited about that. But Europe is really struggling with this, right? So they in general, as a continent, this is not adaptation and speed to adapt takes time. So I'm in tech, and in tech, they were late to cloud, they were late to digital transformation. Europe in general is late and always takes. They're not very good at software. They could be remarkable at software. The talent is incredible. It's all over the place. Across the Baltics, France, Spain, Italy, doesn't matter which European country you pick, their engineers are remarkable. Some of the best engineers in the world. So why don't we have like $5 trillion worth of European software companies? There's only one reason. It has to be with policy and the tax and the way the culture is set up to reward them. And, there's a lot of complex reasons for that, but I think Europe's going to get there. But you can't regraph and remap and re-architect how a country and its society and its fabric can change within a year or 5 years or 10 years. This takes multi-generations. It's a 50 to 100-year process.
Right. But I could argue by then it may be too late with the pace of change and the advent of AI and things that we'll get to coming up shortly. More of a comment of mine than a question, Jim, then I'll get to about 50 more questions. I did speak to a gentleman in Europe, and I'm going to emphasize, I'm being very careful how I phrase this.
Yeah.
A male stated that you can't just work harder and be even smart your way out of a society that is committed to engineering your failure no matter what you do. Why don't we let that one sink in a second for the audience? But that's disturbing when someone would have that perspective or feel that way. Related to the topic, Jim, some of this comes down to, again, the need of immigrants and the perspective how I asked it. And I do believe people deserve to be given a chance. I do think it gets challenging when it comes to culture or assimilating into culture. So when we talk about things like evolution, why has there been more so than in the US? Why has it been challenging in many parts of the world, but definitely Europe? You look at it from a perspective of evolution, mating. Yes, I said mating, not survival, is kind of the name of the evolution game. Isn't that true?
I think so.
Where Where did the perspective of a younger male and female not looking at a perspective of marriage, commitment to community, society, and children? And I know I'm going down some dangerous roads that might take us down the perspective of bifurcating male and female to belief in religion and God and commitment. It seems like the world, and maybe I'm saying it from the perspective of someone who is a believer in faith, I think we're heading down a wrong path, but maybe I'm ignorant. Maybe I need to be taught better.
I don't think so. I think I'll just use something I read the other day that I thought was very interesting. Hollywood has been producing a certain type of content for the last decade. Remarkably, shockingly, the studios have seen their revenues not do as well as they used to.
Indeed.
And so to me, what I love about the world is the more regulatory complexity you introduce and the more you dictate a belief system on a group of people that may or may not share your values, good news, they're going to vote with their wallets. And I think what's great, and what I read just the other day, for everybody who's very faith-based and has a very strong opinion about this, the Judeo-Christian content is making a landmark success. The productions are going through the roof, and it'll probably continue. I'm not in the film industry. I don't underwrite films. I'm not a producer on the side. I'm not a writer. I'm a consumer of content. I have a young family. I believe in great theater and great literature and great film. And it just turns out if you make great entertainment products and you know your audience and you are very specific to the audience you're going after, that audience is going to vote with their wallets, and you're going to see how that responds. So regardless of where you're coming from, whatever type of content you're producing, if you only can produce one type of content, which I think I'm really enjoying talking about, if you just have one view, in general, it's not going to go very well. Because people want custom content, they want experiences, they want outcomes. So I'm really bullish on the future of the world, because I think you're going to see every single individual on the planet say, nope, that's not me, that's not who I am, that's not what I believe in. And if you get to know me and speak to me, whoever you are, from the time you're 6 until you're 96, people are going to demand much more customized experiences based on their values, their society, their community, and what they believe should happen in the future. And their view of the future is going to shape who they actually allow to bring, shall we say, those experiences. And so for film or social media, you're just seeing that, Apple and Facebook are really duking it out over who's a better provider for better, safer, more responsible, more ethical content. And I think you're seeing it. It doesn't mean that Facebook and Apple are perfect, but you're seeing them definitely take a stance, and they're competing to be better than they were in the past, is a nice way to put it. So I'm actually quite bullish that the pendulum has swung and now it's swinging back. And many people might say it's too slow, but in the last year, you're seeing that diversity of opinion on both sides really say, no, we're going to do a lot better at being much more amazing at distributing the information we want you to consume. And people are asking for what I would call a much more complex, message in general. How about that?
I think that's very good. And yes, money always does talk. And there is some changes happening in Hollywood that you noted. I will make the point, and I'm sure I'm wrong somewhere, but broadly, I'm going to be accurate. Name me in the last, forget 10 years, 20 or 30 years, a white male fatherly figure that has somewhat faith-based, that is one out there and shown in a positive light. They all appear to have a little bit of the Homer Simpson, a little bit of the bumbling idiot. There is no question that was a narrative that was pushed. And is it somewhat showing some change? Now, I've stated with my activities in AI that we're at the cusp where everyone is going to be able to be a Hollywood producer, a director. Now, we're not necessarily going to have quite the distribution channels, but the capability of writing storyline and having AI generated characters at the moment come to life, actually, in some ways, it's kind of available now, but within 2 to 4 years, you're going to see that. And that is going to be interesting. But maybe that's a discussion we'll pick up a little bit later in our conversation. We're almost at the end of this part of the conversation before we transition over. But I think important to the word culture, would you agree with this comment? And maybe it's a simple yes or no, Jim. It's up to you. Without a unifying morality, will societies fall apart?
I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to say that society needs to be unified on the society that they want to be part of and live in. And I'm just going to make a statement. I am very fortunate that I grew up in a very diverse city in San Francisco, where I was the only individual who really came from the country I came from. So I came from Norway to Connecticut to San Francisco, and a third of my class was from mainland China. The other quarter of my class they originally came from Japan and Korea and Southeast Asia. And then another quarter of my class was all from Ireland. And then another quarter of the class was from Italy. And so it was a very interesting group. It doesn't represent the dynamics and diversity today, which is much more extraordinary. But it was really pretty much where California ended up today, which is California's part of Asia, period, end of story. And so what I would say to your yes or no question is, at least from a California perspective in the West, in the United States, with the lens that California has and the political and socioeconomic perspective it has, it really will choose what I think. I think it's chosen, frankly, its opinion on everything. And, so I would say in general, the population feels they're in the right place. Now, if you don't believe in that one singular view, California is the last place you want to live, right? So it's really, here's our view, and you either fully embrace it or not. And so that's not set up for everybody. And so but as an alternative, you always have to look at the context. For some people, they want to have the ability to leave whenever they want, and they want to be able to take their money whenever they want. That's not true of every other country on the planet. So California, as an example, is fantastic because it has all the other attributes that they expect and want and desire, but doesn't have in the country that they came from. And so that's why it's referred to as the Gold Mountain in many respects. So I would say it's a yes and no, but it depends on where you are, and at least in the United States, and at least what section of the United States you're in. And I think it's a different answer based on where you go, because the US is a very complex country.
Is it much to do about nothing, Jim? Or should I be gravely concerned, like apparently I am? My final question / comment on Europe, I believe, is going to be that the police or a police commissioner in the UK threatening to go and arrest people for a social media post, threatening to come to America and quote unquote pluck us out and bring us there. And then we see the situation in France with the founder or co-founder, Durov, he's a billionaire and someone that we know, like Musk, is also a billionaire who has a platform, but the founder of Telegram is arrested. Now, we could argue, was he doing some things that have some levels of concern? Perhaps, but I think we're going down a road that is extremely concerning to me.
Yeah, I think you're your view is well founded. I think the real challenge is short term. You're going to see more disruption. That's the best way to put it. There's going to be a lot more disruption, especially in the areas that you talked about. Is that going to work out well for humanity, humanity will address that over time, but not in the next year. So where we are is very disconcerting if you have a 12-month view and probably a 5-year view. You look at the decisions that were made in the UK, over the last decade, it's very clear where everything is versus where it was. And so now it's just a question of what kind of balance will there be? And there might not be balance. They might just go completely the opposite direction. And I'm just going to go right to the community of listeners because I think this is important. Capital gains taxes matter. So if you change the capital gains tax, you are going to see radical transformation really fast. And so congratulations for everyone in the UK. I love London. I love the United Kingdom. I love England. I love Wales. I love Ireland. It's amazing. I lived there for 4 years of my life. I think it's one of the most incredible places in the world to be. And I think most people would agree. Unfortunately, if you're in business or you're a family office or you're a venture capitalist or you're an entrepreneur or you're in private equity or you're an asset manager, you have to be very concerned about the current status of their thinking about that impact on capital gains and capital gains tax. It's going to change the British economy foundationally. So if you wanted to ruin a country and its vibrancy and its sovereignty, that's one way to go about it. And if they keep doing that over the next 50 years, yeah, the UK is going to be a very different place than it is today, which used to be the global center of finance. And it ceded that, and now it's seeming to cede more of its economic sovereignty. And if they don't want to attract capital, that is one way to do it. And they might see capital flight begin to occur in greater speed with greater purpose. So
I have more questions on the potential taxation of unrealized capital gains coming up a little bit later, and they get very intriguing, audience. I promise. Okay, we maybe have a clip moment here in a 30 or 60-second short, Jim. Following up on my last question, what do you think are the odds over the next 12 months? We know it would happen in Brazil, that literally this would be laughable 2 weeks ago, that literally Elon could be arrested. Maybe here in the US, maybe he's traveling to France. I would say it was 0 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm not so sure that depending on a variety of scenarios, it may not be up to 5 or 10%. This is shocking.
Yeah, I think it's very surprising from our vantage point, but it's probably not surprising at all. I mean, I'm very fortunate to do business in Brazil, and I've been fortunate that I was in a shipping business for a long time, and so for us, South America has always been just one of the most remarkable places. I wish I had gone to college in South America. There's very few regrets I have, but that's one of them. So the society and the country of Brazil, it's remarkable. I think many Brazilians are proud of that decision, and many are not. And I think that over time, you'll see that was not very helpful for attracting capital, I believe. So, unless, of course, the capital you want to attract is from China, and China and Brazil are going to work very closely together. And I think if you're from Shanghai or Beijing, you're thrilled about, one of many Chinese entrepreneurs think Elon Musk is remarkable, but, many Chinese businessmen are going to do what the state directs, and they're going to fall right into line. And, China and Brazil are going to be very close and working much closer, and they're going to flourish, and their economies will become interwoven. And you're seeing that. And I think you're seeing the politics and the politicians and the individuals we're talking about, they're just making decisions that give them a lot of sovereign power. And that is a classic example of what happens when you have a concentration of power. And so that's what we're witnessing. And that seems very surprising from a US perspective, but from a Brazilian perspective, not so surprising, actually.
I've learned from a great relationships and mentorship, people like yourself and Adam Robinson and other amazing guests that I've even had on, to imagine, and maybe this is what family offices have to do, imagine the unmanageable, that this is a starting point for analysis of either opportunity or risk. In other words, no matter how wealthy you are, there's far more going on in the world that you don't know than you know. As
Yes.
a family, even a billionaire, how do you grapple with that? And how do you know how to take advantage of opportunity or when you need to hedge certain risks and take chips off the table?
My answer to this is always the same. And maybe we should have started off here, some 48 minutes ago. Stability, the world believes stability is normal. It's the exact opposite. So what we're going through now is actually the way the world has always been. Very chaotic, very unpredictable, very unstable, constant war, constant change, constant immigration. I would say that the world is just reverting to the world that has the way it's always been, which is all the risks have always been there. It's just what happened at the end of World War II is the United States ushered in a time, and many people who are European in my family may not appreciate this comment, but it's just true. The United States ushered in a level of stability, greater stability than the world has ever seen. And so no matter where you are in the political spectrum in world history, the last 75 years have been more stable than any prior time in history. And so technically, we're just reverting back to what the world's really good at, which is a lot of complexity and a lot of instability. And that's what has always been the case. So,
Of course, the US has many problems. We have a
massive, massive.
massive deficit. We
Yeah.
have interest well above 1 trillion on the deficit. We take in what, maybe 4 to 5 trillion from taxation. If you utilize the growth of the deficit and what could happen to those interest payments, what happens when they're 2 trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion? Do you just print more money? I don't see any way out of this relative to declining GDP. Now, we could argue energy, fusion energy, AI, enhanced productivity, and maybe we may get to some of those. But what appears to be a solution, or are we simply constantly kicking this down the road?
Well, I think one, we've always been constantly kicking it down the road since the end of World War One, and
Hmm.
the reality is the dollar has bought. I think the statistics are somewhere between 97 and 99% less than when it first was broadly distributed across the banking system, and we had a unified currency. Purchasing power is going to continue to go down. Costs will continue to go up. Instability will continue and grow and escalate with speed. And that just means the currency will decline. If you look at it from every 5 years, its purchasing power and its value and the basket of currencies that the dollar has represented as a reserve currency, that exorbitant privilege will go away. There's no question about it. The real question is when, and no, I don't think anyone can predict that. The dollar has moments where it is a great place to be. And despite all the grave challenges the US represents and the lack of, the United States is politically unstable. And I think everyone clearly now sees that. And if this summer didn't give you a good view of how unstable the country is, that political instability should just tell you that we're at a new crossroads where people are going to have to be very careful about how concentrated they are and how much of a portfolio risk they really are willingly accepting. And so, I would argue, given what you stated, it's just going to come with a lot greater risk and a lot greater volatility, which means a lot less solvency and the liquidity people are used to in the United States and the safe haven, that is going to deteriorate and continue to deteriorate.
So since 1944 in Bretton Woods, the US has been the world reserve currency, meaning the
Yeah.
dollar.
Yeah.
And its utilization percentage, I believe, is down to 68, 69%. You mentioned China, Brazil, two of the companies that make up the BRICS, add in India, add in potentially Saudi Arabia. You already see the weakening and the challenges, maybe what quasi makes the $35 trillion deficit. I'm not going to use the word acceptable, but the fact of the world kind of settles in dollars arguably helps us, at least for now. If you're going to state it's just a matter of time, well, of course you're right. Is that 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or 30 years? And what is going to replace the dollar, or is it going to be a basket of securities?
I think it's going to
Commodity.
be a basket. I think the answer is it's going to be a basket, and it's going to have less a global share. That dominance is continuing to deteriorate. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Of course, a question you knew was going to come, Jim, and enjoy answering it. Who will win the U.S. election in November?
I'm going to be very careful how I say this. I don't think anyone's going to win. So whoever does win, and I don't know who's going to win, but whoever does win is going to inherit all the challenges we just talked about. So quite frankly, I see just the fragmentation of the country's economies and the share and allocation of economic opportunity lessening and becoming more challenging and difficult every quarter going forward. And so the state will end up taking up more power. States will have more power. The federal government will have more power. What that means is for almost every American and American family, you're going to be taxed more. You are going to be able to purchase less. And your ability to have, shall we say, resiliency in these markets, whatever you believe your resiliency is, and the levels of protection from a tax, from a liquidity, from a solvency, from accessibility, no matter how you judge where you are, you're going to find the operating environment to be much more challenging, regardless of who wins.
And we're going to get to, I know you have very strong opinions on liquidity, which will partially also answer the question that's part of the title. Let me push back just a little bit.
Sure.
From an Americana perspective. We have fish on both sides. We have, let's go with the word, I could choose another, friendly neighbors to the north and south. We have the Mississippi River that provides incredible farming and agriculture in the US. We have energy reserves. We have natural resources. We have so-called rule of law. We have a lot of people, but not overwhelming given the size of our land. We have demographic issues, but not as bad as some parts of the world, including Europe. We have, as much as I may make fun of them sometimes, Silicon Valley and big tech. We also still are the world's reserve currency and have, I'm going to state, the world's greatest military. At worst, it's among the top two. Where is this all going to collapse so quickly if those wheels start turning?
Well, to me, it's a sovereignty risk, right? So if you look at sovereignty and territorial integrity, that's generally how you do well. That's been the history of the world and economies. So when another country controls your borders, you have less ability to control economics and the supply chains. And so the challenge for the United States is its sovereignty and its ability to protect its system and the way our operating, our OS, I'll be very valley now, our OS, how we run our country and run money and run trade and conduct commerce. That ability, that autonomy, that independence, the remarkable privilege that we have today is just going to continue to be challenged, deteriorate, and it's going to cost a lot more to defend and protect and scale. And so all the costs are going to go up, all the risks are going up, which means your sovereignty is going down, which means your adaptability is going down, which means you're not as resilient as you thought you were, which means you're going to have to put in more risk and more governance and more structure in place to actually put in what I would call the kind of transparency you're going to need to see what's happening and to be able to adapt. And that's just going to be very expensive. And with great expense comes a lot more cost, which means profits are going to go down, which means, quite frankly, I just see the kind of economic growth that we've enjoyed since literally when I entered the workforce, which was 1985, That 39-year time has been an incredible moment to build businesses and build industries and to build out economies, and that is going to go the other way. I would say that we're on a downward slope. That doesn't mean it won't be remarkable, but we are now, without question, that's just the cost basis and the structure and capital required to continue to scale with the debt levels and the competition levels. It's going to be very hard.
Okay, Jim, you get me a little off course because I'm going to ask an investing question. We'll come back and we'll get back to that. If that is the case and things are trending in a non-positive direction, let's be honest, most wealthy Americans, AKA family offices, they're probably 95% plus denominated in dollars in terms of their investing, whether it's equities, whether it's bonds, treasuries, real estate. If the dollar were to go down and down, if some of the challenges that you noted were to happen, what could families do from an investing perspective to hedge against these possible risks? My follow-up is going to be, if I'm hedging against those risks and they take longer to happen or don't happen, am I hurting myself with the cost of hedging because I moved assets that were performing to more non-performing?
Well, how about if I say behind all of that is a return? That's a return construct. So from an absolute return, figure out where your time horizon is. That's a financial return question. I would argue you have to look at both wealth preservation. So to start off, because you talked about family offices, you need to protect your wealth. That's number one. So protecting your wealth means you're not going to lose it. And so wealth preservation and long-term conservation and continuity, that is everything. And that is underweighted right now as a strategy because most people have been focused on their return models, right? So if you look at it from a long-term return perspective, 50 to 100 years, there's two things in your statement that you made, which were, which is what everybody needs to ask. You are over concentrated in dollar denominated assets, number one. So you have to de-risk that. You have to have a much more nuanced approach. And you absolutely need to look at what are the other risks, solvency, liquidity, access, the forensic auditability, your ability to prove that you own the asset. The bottom line is you need to have much more balance in preservation as opposed to just absolute return. Because you could argue that the returns in the last 30 years have been stunning. So the expectation that you're going to continue to have those returns for the next 30 to 50 years, maybe, but most likely not. So you have to actually take that approach and work at how do you just really focus on preserving your wealth and then taking very calculated, very long-term bets. So an area that I like, everybody talks about investing in AI right now. Well, it turns out the best way to invest in AI is own access to energy and power and have the ability to leverage real estate, which has always been part of a wealth preservation strategy. As part of a return strategy, being in a REIT has been very powerful for most people's portfolios. And so from a portfolio management perspective, if you don't have enough exposure to what I would call the data center space, you're going to really miss on the great returns in AI. And the best family offices are all heavily invested in data center and REIT infrastructure and the power management systems and the energy and the grids that actually, make that all possible. So that's a great way to play a short term, meaning the next 25 years, the transition from artificial intelligence to generative AI to super intelligence and AGI and then super specific super intelligence. Regardless of which expert you talk to, that's a journey. And that journey, the people who are going to do the best are the people who are actually powering all those systems. And so, I've been in the data center industry since 1995. And if you look at those returns, they've been remarkable. So that's my answer to that.
And
question.
we'll get more into perhaps
Yeah.
supply chains, gold, maybe
Yeah.
even Bitcoin. So, audience, stay tuned. If you don't mind, Jim, as we're about halfway through, uh, your sponsor today is Mr. Robles. It's me. So, I do want to take just a minute to explain. If you're enjoying this conversation with Jim, and he's an amazingly talented man, and we still have much more to go, imagine what my members in SFO continuity having access to pre-access, sometimes kind of post game where we have the guest on in special 30-minute segments, to the ability to be invited to the webinar and interact. And more importantly, the proprietary content that I do, proprietary that I write, that I share, and the events that I host, practically a breakfast and a luncheon every month. Every month. In June of this summer, I did 7 of them. So we're extremely active. It's only meant for 30 founders. Then we'll consider, after probably a 90-month reprieve, opening up to non-founder status. There's a couple of spots left. Go to angelorobles.com and learn more about membership. And I know I've said this before, and maybe I beat it a little too hard. I know I'm not the most likable guy in the world. And I know some of you that probably even join or watch don't even like me. That's okay. The problem with the community is it's too boring. It's too vanilla. No one pushes any boundaries. The questions that I asked Jim before, most other guests that I would look to have on that are your so-called family office community, they want no part of those questions. They don't want to talk about real things that are happening, things that we could have a dialogue so I could learn. I'm not saying my opinions are always right. They're not. But the importance of having open and honest discussions that go deep and are intellectual, that is worth 100x whatever I charge to be a member in what I do. If you participate and you take action upon the insight and the opportunities and the connections. So very simply, go to angelorobles.com and join. Jim, you got a really hard one coming up. Here it is. If Trump is Trump running against Kamala Harris, or is he really running against a system that requires a candidate that they can control, which means having original ideas is a disqualification?
Such a great question. My daughter would say he's running against himself. So she thinks he's going to lose because Kamala and her running mate are much more polished, or shall we say, they don't expose themselves to as much risk as Trump does. So if you embrace a candidate who is very open and honest and direct, and you're getting what you're getting because he's right there. He gives you content every day and every hour to debate and disagree with him and dislike him immensely. For some people, that's extremely attractive. And so it's very obvious why many people would choose him. And then there's other people who would like a much more polished, refined, or shall we say, vanilla, platform. And I think it's going to be very interesting how it plays out. But the bottom line is that there is no getting around the facts that both of these candidates need to address at a, shall we say, at a systems level. The system is not working, and it's not working for a majority of the country. And so that is a remarkable problem. And lots of people love to spend time, especially politicians, on who's to blame. But the reality is almost every state in the country is going to have to rethink how they are going to reinvest in their infrastructure. And so my point of view is that I think critical infrastructure is going to be critical for every single American. So whether you believe that that is providing you water or great treatment systems and great power and resiliency around your power and your energy and everything you need to go when you go to the hospital, the lights need to be on. When you get in public transportation, it needs to work. The electrification needs to work. So the basics of what made America work before now don't work very well at scale. And now they're old and they're crumbling and they're dangerous. And so I think regardless of which candidate wins and who's more committed to, upgrading America's critical infrastructure, the critical infrastructure is no longer just roads and ports and airports and highways and, power systems. It's our educational system. It's our healthcare system. It's our educational system. And it is frail, broken, and it's failing faster. So that is going to be the challenge for these two candidates. And it's clear to me, if you look at um, one candidate is very, very clear that they think the system has been owned and controlled by one group of people for far too long, and it's time to let his constituents to come and run the country. And the reality is, the country is run by a group of people. My wife's family were SESs, and the president doesn't necessarily dictate how the country is run. And so, regardless of what words you want to use, the professional class of government officials who are back in Washington, they run this country, and they're going to continue to run this country. So I think that's my answer back to you, Angelo, about Trump. It's not really him. It's that group has a commitment and loyalty through their own group and their own processes and systems. And they've gained more power and grown more over the last 20 years than they've ever grown in history. And so that class and that professional class, we're talking about very, very, very exceptionally well-educated people, very, very bright people. It's a remarkable a job. You get to work for the federal government, and the government pays well, and your pension is taken care of, and people may not make as much money in the private sector, but it's a guaranteed job, and it's the largest, fastest growing part, it seems, in that part of the country. And I just think it's going to get more powerful, whether that's under Kamala or it's under a Donald. So there you go.
And related to kind of your daughter's comments, and she would fit the demographic of what I'm going to say. And I don't know what your advice, or probably better, her advice would be to Trump. And that would be, it's obvious he does not do well with Generation Z. And
Right.
let's just be blunt, he does rather horrific with unmarried women. Those are a significant audience that he probably could have a more attuned and empathetic message for, that would probably, it may be too late now, it would probably almost assure victory. Yet it appears to be just very, very hard for him, from ignorance to ego to a variety of different things. And I don't mean acquiescent on your values, but he does seem to waffle on some of the issues relative to the things that I brought up, mainly on female rights and things like that. Reproductive rights. So interesting, probably more of a comment than a question to you, Jim,
Okay.
but just something that I think is very obvious to the audience. Like, if he loses, it's probably because of that. And it's a little bit, and again, your daughter is like a Nostradamus. She's right. Like, he's probably his own worst enemy, effectively, from that perspective.
But
On that note,
go for it.
a sunny and shiny question. If Trump wins the election, so surprisingly that I'm phrasing it this way, if Trump wins the election, will a civil war ensue?
I think that's, I don't know. And I would defer to, our, the Defense Department and the intelligence community and our emergency responders and the subject matter experts in civil society. It's not going to be as calm and normal. Normal meaning there will be more chaos. And I don't know if it's going to be civil war. I don't see that. What I see is conflict, open conflict. And this has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with economics. So when people are struggling and they do not have access to all the key ingredients you need to have a successful life. So if you can't feed your family, there will be more chaos. If you can't provide a safe place to sleep consistently, there will be more chaos. If people don't have access to clean water and good food, half the world's population is not getting the micronutrients they need. This is not going to scale well, not just in the United States, but anywhere. So I think the real challenge is it's not one of inflation. It's really simply accessibility to the key resources and foundational assets that almost every single member of our communities across the country need, from the poorest to the richest. And, it's just like your body. If you have a weak spot in your body and you have bad ankles, you're not going to do well long term. Or if you have bad eyes or you have a bad heart, just once you have one or two or even three acute challenges, physically, biologically, disease level, you're just going to struggle. And I think what we're seeing is cascading challenges to the fabric to provide the resiliency and adaptability that our society needs. And these candidates are struggling with that. And I would say Kamala is doing a great job in one area. Her team knows her audience is on TikTok. Trump's team knows this, but he needs to embrace that platform regardless of who owns and controls, that content. And so that's just where that generation is. And he has done a good job of having his daughter-in-law. She's risen in prominence and importance. She's remarkable. But young women across the country, regardless of background, want to see more women in more powerful positions, regardless of what their environment is, whether their mom is, whether they've been raised by a single mother, or they've had the good fortune of having, a very large, family around them. We are educating the smartest, greatest generation ever, and they expect more, and they want people to be accountable, and they expect people to be treated more fairly and have the access that all of us, at least we have access to a phone, we have access to a desktop, we have access to an internet connection. This younger generation expects all of that, and they expect to be provided. And in many cases, they demand. That's not a right. It's not a privilege. It's a right. And so this is where that fabric of society is going to come undone at scale, I believe.
Jim, I hear many families mention, I have 15, 20, 25, 30% in treasuries. I don't mean 30-year
Sure.
treasuries, but short term. And
Yeah.
it's paying, broadly speaking, well. Angelo, I know it's safe short term. I have dry powder for opportunities. Yet if I listen to what maybe we both said about dollar denominated assets, about challenges, the election, but this also relates to liquidity. Should they maintain 10, 20, 30% in something like short-term treasuries, or are they missing out on opportunities, or is that not enough? They should have more.
Depends on where they are in their life and their risk profile. But I would say the 60-40 portfolio, everybody is debating now, right? So that's my first answer. My second answer is, if you are okay with having 95 to 99.999% of your assets tied up into one denomination of currency, and you're comfortable and you sleep at night and that works for you, terrific. It's just, in history, that's never worked out very well. So, people have to realize that the risk profile that they've embraced and that has been time honored and, shall we say, has been what everyone does, they're going to have to rethink that, because we're not in an environment that is normal anymore, and it is changing rather dramatically. And so volatility is going to continue, and I would argue it will cascade globally. And it doesn't mean that people can't do a remarkable job at managing their portfolio or use, all the other products that are out there and ETF products that are out there. But I think people have really favored illiquidity and concentration over a much more adaptive wealth management portfolio risk off approach that's biased towards wealth preservation. So I think people have to shift, and they have to shift quickly. And I think shift quickly means they have the next 5 years to really think this through, but they're over concentrated. So look at how concentrated everyone is from an equity perspective and from a market segment perspective. And that's just not gonna play well. So, and if you just look at the concentration of wealth that's in the top 25 stocks, that's going to be very challenging.
And
So
Jim, do you look at alternative currency plays, potentially the Swiss franc, maybe the Singapore dollar? Is it the Norwegian krona? And that may not be easy for some families to access. Do they need international European or Asian entities, family offices? Is that a wise move?
I think it's a blended risk. Back to your point about treasuries, treasuries have been terrific and treasuries have been part of everyone's portfolio. I think you're going to have to look at how concentrated your treasury portfolio is, regardless of the duration risk. And then, in terms of other currencies, there's a lot of tax complications. So I think really it comes down to this. Do you want to have liquidity? Treasuries are amazing from a liquidity perspective. Do you want to balance that out with another basket? I think it makes sense to have, if you don't have exposure to a broad basket of other currencies, whether you're looking at it from a hedging perspective and financial absolute return perspective, I look at it from a wealth preservation perspective. And mine is colored by my family's history, and they're European, they're Norwegian, and Norway was invaded during World War II. And Norway suffered dramatically. It was always a poor country and it became even poorer. And then in the 60s, things went well. But, Norway has a lot of concentration risk. And so, having a lot of your wealth concentrated in one country doesn't make sense anymore. And so no matter how great, the Nordics are and how great the Americas are, you need to think about diversifying your portfolio. And I think most families need to be a lot more open and a lot more flexible, and meeting with family offices from Asia. If you're only in New York and San Francisco, you should be sitting down with family offices across Asia. You should be in India sitting down with families that are managing multi-generational wealth and asking them, what are you doing? What are you thinking? I think what's missing is the diversity of opinion, and the strategies that people are deploying are not diverse enough, and they're overly concentrated, is my general comment. And so I think the Swiss families and many German and Austrian and Dutch families have done a beautiful job over the last 200 years navigating very complex environments. And I think you can see that regardless of the countries that they live in, you can see how they've done very well, at least preserving their wealth, and now being very careful about how they think about continuity and that longevity, and how they actually protect across multiple different generations of their family, in a family office platform. And then where do they actually deploy their capital? And the United States has always been an amazing place to deploy your capital. It just maybe doesn't make as much sense to have 95 to 99% of your capital deployed here, especially in one currency. So.
And Jim, what's your opinion from a investing perspective, more so hedging risk
Sure.
on gold, and specifically, okay, but how do I own it? The typical investor, simply it's a small allocation in an ETF. Someone who's more concerned about banking, systemic risk, a lot of things that could go wrong, may want to have physical ownership of gold.
Sure.
How do they do that? Do they store it in the Swiss mountains? Where do they go?
Well, it turns out, actually, that is an answer for a lot of the best.
I know that.
In Indonesia. And it turns out it's very wise. And so I would say yes. And you should look at whatever allocation you and your portfolio manager have looked at, or your chief investment officer or your team, and just look at from an allocation perspective. If it's all digital, that's too much concentration. You need physical. What does that look like? Where should it reside? Should it all be in the same country? Absolutely not. Where are many people putting their gold? They're putting it in Switzerland, they're putting it in Singapore. Well, what I always like to say to people, look at what happened to Singapore during World War II. That did not go well. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on security and physical security and safeguarding gold. I just know that I have that diversity myself, and I have a balance between physical and digital, and I have multiple locations, and I've chosen locations that have done very well during war, and Switzerland is one of those places. And the Swiss companies who are involved in storing physical gold and protecting physical gold are really, they've gotten very sophisticated at their offering, and they continue to evolve their products. And from a portfolio perspective, if you can have allocation, get enough allocation, I think that's a wise consideration in 2025.
Jim, I did several interviews. My audience could go to one of my YouTube platforms, really both of them, at Family Office and at Family Office TV, and see this summer and two in the winter with a gentleman in Europe. Actually, two of them were in person in Europe. His name is Octavian Pilati. He's from 1,000-year-old, effectively primarily German family. And I asked
Amazing.
him about generational wealth and assets, and he said land, art, gold, and gems. We already kind of covered gold. We don't necessarily have to cover everything, but I have found more and more of my, especially billion-dollar families, interested in art. And specifically, what I just said about or you said as well, about direct ownership and storing it in maybe Freeport zones around the world, including Switzerland, seems like a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would say that I don't have any deep background in collecting, a portfolio of what I would say the gems and a vast art collection. I'm just like every other normal person. But if you love art, you believe in art, and that art has value, and you have the right people around you, and take a portfolio approach to it, does it make sense to be part of your total asset allocation? I don't know. But if, just like land, if you love it and you live with it every day and it makes you happy, and then you've done a very good job about thinking about where it resides. And I think if you take a long-term perspective, and I love the 1,000-year view, my family's never had that luxury, but it's had a very, very long view, much more than 200 years. And all I would say is that, yeah, art passed down through families, great art, if it works for you, tends to be valued and appreciate over a long period of time. So I think we'd all love to go back in time and be in Paris and scoop everything up.
We should have listened to this Van Gogh guy. He may have knew a thing or two about creating very valuable art.
Yeah, so it's, but you had to have you believed in a different lifestyle back then. And so, my grandmother on my mom's side was one of those individuals, and she did live in that community, and she did find a piece of art that spoke to her. And lo and behold, it's not in a Guggenheim museum or in a private collection, but it's not an insignificant, valuable item today. And so it's just one of those things where if you always are thinking about the return, and you're always thinking about, the return model, if you buy the best asset in real estate and you don't like where that real estate is, and you're never going to go there, that may not make as much sense. So then the question is, what happens on that land? So people are like, okay, where should I put data center assets? There's great data center assets that you can, invest in and deploy capital in Europe. Remarkable. However, you have to love being there, and you have to love the people, and you have to love the food. And for people like me, that was easy. And for Facebook and for Google, they agreed. And so there's a lot of great data center investments in Norway and Sweden, because there's a lot of great access to the right energy portfolio. And that's, Denmark has been working on that, since the 60s and done a remarkable job. So it really comes down to, I believe, diversity and longevity. And if you take a diversity and longevity perspective, land is a remarkable asset, and maybe, fine art and, valuable jewels fit into your strategy, but it has to be a personal strategy. I think that's what I'm really trying to say. And I think what's very hard for people is we are naturally aligned with our own bias, and that's confirmation bias. And Daniel Kahneman, who we all love, he just passed away. I mean, one of the most remarkable men in history. I mean, who doesn't love him? So I think that's a great way to say, if you think about wealth preservation and portfolio management and looking at generating the greatest returns over the longest period of time, it requires strategic planning and thinking and continuity. And if you do that over a long period of time, you're rewarded. You're not going to avoid all the major risks, but at least you're going to guard against over-concentration and a lack of liquidity. If you do that, you're going to do well, I think.
Of course, of course. supply chains, logistics, infrastructure. We touched on it a little bit. I think of ports, I think of rail, I think of trucking, I think of data centers. These appear to be, if I was a significant billion-dollar family, where I may want to have diverse and direct ownership of. Not every one of us is a billion or really a multi-billion-dollar family. Could I
Yep.
get exposure to those resources in the public markets, or even strategically being an LP investor?
Absolutely, you can, through critical infrastructure funds, and there's many different vehicles to participate in that. And I just think it really comes down to what your preferences are. So, for instance, many people who are in the Greek business community are very comfortable with owning shipping assets and shipping and logistics assets. Same with a lot of people in the Nordics. Strong history there. But I'll just make this personal. Some members of my family didn't like all the different risks: currency risk, trade risk, um, union risks, just automation risks. There's so many different risks to shipping and logistics. And so one part of my family chose everything on land and avoided everything that went out to sea. And the ones who chose everything on land, they did better, it turns out, because being on the open water, it costs a lot of energy. And obviously, it's a highly depreciating asset. So unless you're really good at managing fleets at scale, which very few people are, you're going to do less well than people who own property and then let everybody else develop on top of that property. And you can go into a private public partnership, and the people and families who've invested in real estate and terminals have done very, very well for the last 100 years, especially the last 30. And now it turns out, where does everybody want to have their data center assets? At those ports and terminals. So it just turns out that if you look at from I wouldn't say one asset class and one segment in an asset class, I would look at what are the adjacencies. And so it just turns out everything around ports and airports, that's where world trade is. That's generally very safe. It's generally, there's a state who's going to make sure that everyone behaves correctly. And in California, California real estate was pretty good. And if you invested in real estate near the ports and airports around California, the major ones have probably done very well. And I think over 100-year period, if you look at where are those places around the world today, in the FT earlier today, great example, young man from Bangladesh, rock star entrepreneur, learned, hacked, remarkable. And he had one of the greatest outcomes in history as an entrepreneur, and his company was acquired. And if you read the article, you'll see that he thought less about where Australia was and Bangladesh was, but more that people needed more data center footprint. And he built a very, very specific offering. And he looked at it from a supply chain perspective. And as a result, he was rewarded. And he had the best investors in the world in critical infrastructure back him. And then he had many companies seek to acquire the asset, and it was acquired. It was announced. And there you go. A $16 billion asset.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What do you look into that Warren Buffett liquidated a utterly massive amount of Apple stock?
Mm-hmm.
Is he on the inside of something that we don't know? Is he smart in terms of hedging risk? Does he see major challenges happening with the election and post the election?
It's very tough to tell. And I think that's such a great question. I think you just have to be comfortable with the business and where it is. And I would say he was more comfortable with the business before, where it was and who was leading it. And now you see that there's going to be a lot of geopolitical risk associated with Apple, because Apple's market has been very concentrated in two of the most remarkable economies in history, China and the United States. And I think as the risks around those supply chains continue, and as the Taiwanese question of where Foxconn and Quanta, who are the two major partners to building out all the Apple products, if you just look at it from a pure supply chain perspective, that concentration risk is acute. And so as fast as Apple moves its supply chain and continues to distribute its supply chain and distribute that risk, it's going to take them longer. And if anything goes wrong in the next 5 years, and most likely it won't, but in case it does, there is no way that that company will be able to continue to produce the kind of returns it has over the last 20 years. So it just means that it's going to be more risky to hold more of Apple. Does Apple belong in people's portfolio? I defer to their portfolio managers. Everyone as it, and by the way, he's also at a different age, right? So, so let's just be really candid. You don't know what was behind that, or I'm sure some of your listeners do. I just don't happen to know because I don't sit with him every morning at breakfast, but you have to look at the lens of the.
You got to go to more diners in Omaha and have some cherry Coke, Jim. What's wrong with you?
Well, we all know that Berkshire has some of the most elite CEOs in history sitting behind Warren. So you're talking about a team, let's call it 500, remarkable, the best and the brightest in the world assembled under one platform and under one brand, under that beautiful man and that beautiful face and his legendary investment with his partner. And we all love Berkshire and everybody does. But the reality is, the risks that Apple will face over the next 10 years are very different than the risks that they faced from 2007 until recently. So I think that's the way anyone should look at it. So should you own more Apple or less Apple? That's up to your risk profile and where you are in your career and your investing strategy. But to me, yes, I believe he was over concentrated. So it makes sense to me that position has been changed.
We discussed it somewhat earlier, but I'll cue it up a little bit
Sure.
more directly. Do you see liquidity as the greatest threat to family offices moving forward, and why?
100%. 100%. Because it's wonderful to have wealth and a position and assets. But if you don't have the ability to prove that that digital asset is yours, and most people's assets are digital, they're DTC. So if you own an asset that's digital and you don't own and control DTC, you have to look at the ownership of DTC and what your ability is to prove to DTC that that security is yours. So that means you have to have the same level of authority that the state has, i.e., New York, the Federal Reserve, US Treasury. You have to be at that table to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, that's mine. And so anything that's digital, if you don't have the ability to implement a zero trust infrastructure around your financial platform where you've been given a regulatory authority to operate, that ATO, which means most family offices, let's just say this out loud, most family offices over the last 1,000 years controlled a financial institution. The majority, and not most, the majority. So many of the greatest family offices in Europe, they all owned a banking or financial services institution. They did. That's just factual. So then the question really becomes are you allowed to own and operate a bank? Well, you need to go to your regulator. So what is your ability to influence your regulator to convince them that you deserve liquidity when everybody else doesn't? Well, we know who deserves the most liquidity in the country. Anyone who's a shareholder in JP Morgan Chase is probably going to do better than everyone else. I think that's fantastic. On a personal level, they just happen to be my bank. But I did have some capital because I'm in California in a smaller regional bank, and that bank was absorbed. We had a banking crisis. It was short, but it lasted long enough that there was no liquidity left, and then everybody realized, wait a minute, I have my money in there, and only so much of it is insured. So I believe liquidity, and I'm just using that example, liquidity is everything. So that means what level of access do you have? What rights can your lawyers prove that that resource, that asset, that position is yours? And you're not susceptible to rehypothecation.
We could do a whole program about that.
It's my favorite subject. Yeah.
Yes, it is. At a relatively recent Rothschild event, a Fortune 500 CEO in food and agriculture noted, we have fought many wars over oil. We will fight bigger wars over food and water. He linked this to the government intervention, protectionism, and commodity surpluses. Is he right or potentially right about how negatively this could play out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the bottom line is this is going to be very challenging. Deeply challenging.
Okay. I mean, that solemnness in your tone kind of says it all. We may have to come back and revisit this one. Uh, I knew I
Well,
was going to get one
you
zinger in
can
there
ask it
that
a
was going
different
to be,
way. You can ask it a different way, and I'll be very, very. I'll speak for a few
Why
minutes.
don't I put it in this way, which may have a little more of a positive connotation to some degree? If I'm an ultra wealthy person or family office, should I be investing in water rights and farmland?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the reason why I was very solemn in the beginning is your ability to own and control land is predicated on your ability for the state and the federal government to afford you the ability to continue to own that land.
And yeah, to not take it from you with eminent domain in the US and likely in other countries.
Or simply liquidate you at the right price. And it's the economic outcome is great, but it wasn't the time. You wanted to have more exposure to that asset longer. So even though you got a great return, you may have dependency on that asset because you've made another adjacent bet. And so, so it's the challenge really is going to be for anyone who's an investor in those kinds of resources. The more strategic and critical that the infrastructure is, the more important it is to have the backing of the state and the government behind you. And if you have that, you're going to do well. But if you don't have that and you're not part of that community, that may be challenging.
Yes, I have discussed this on other programs. Some of you watch my programs with Ian Burlingame. Very interesting stuff. Jim, we probably got about 25 more minutes. I have 30
Sure.
questions. We're not going to be able to get
Go
through
for it.
them, but I'm probably going to pick 10 and maybe we'll try to buzz through them relatively quickly. I'm going to go back to the unrealized capital gains or the potential of taxing unrealized capital gains with a little bit of a twist as a follow up. Do you think it's being presented as a tax the rich to appeal to 99.9%, but eventually would be used to confiscate assets from the middle class?
Well, I wouldn't say confiscation for the middle class. I'll just say that the middle class will continue to be taxed consistently for the next 20 years. So a great way to look at this is if I continue to reside in California, what will the franchise tax board continue to charge me? And I think it's fair to say, I don't think anyone really knows, but it's very clear if you just use any economic data and you put that into any model, you're going to end up losing after taxes, probably per year, much greater than the current numbers that they're projecting by probably 250 to 350 basis points. So I now know that based on where California is and their approach to their budget and how they're structuring their economic taxation strategies, since they're taxing everything, I expect them to continue to tax everything else they haven't taxed before. So I believe that they will fall in love with dynamic pricing because of AI. So I believe that what it costs to move on anything that had any energy component put into it, electrified or non-electrified, it's going to be taxed differently, which means that is going to take more money from my wallet, which means I'm going to have less money to put back into the economy, which means I'm going to become more dependent on the Californian government, that's where they're going. So if you're middle class
Yes.
or upper middle class, that just means your wealth will be confiscated. They just won't say it that way, but the franchise tax board's job is to do its job, and they're doing a great job. And they're and they continue to grow and expand. And I would say they're in a growth mode. I would say their growth mode is, I think it's their growth is very predictable, and you can see which way it's going. Yeah.
Jim, will the implementation of tariffs on Chinese and other foreign goods cause inflation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
we are going round robin, so that's a round robin quick answer. A little bit of a nefarious one. The price of home insurance is increasing at an alarming rate. I'm feeling it. Could this eventually cause the average American to have to sell their homes because they can't afford the insurance? And the nefarious part, is this part of a master plan? After all, private equity is one of the largest homeowners.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a master plan. I would say it's just great strategy, policy, and economic mastery. Many of my friends who happen to be in real estate, they understand the opportunity and the growth and the margins by investing in the rental market, and so they're looking at it from a very complex asset class level, and they're investing. I believe investing in that market is very complicated, and you have to have extraordinary data and extraordinary teams. And so the best teams are aggregating greater talent, and they're doing greater analysis. They've never had more data. Every year we get better data and we get better quality data, and that data allows you to make extremely accurate, relatively less risky decisions than you were afforded even 5 to 10 years ago. And so those investment teams are, I think they're producing extraordinary returns for their shareholders. And so, so that is not so much a master plan. It's just great planning on their part to go and run that model and continue to generate the returns they're making. And I think people should assume more of that. So as a result, that's just going to put a lot more pressure, on the system, which will make what I would say the insurance costs continue to go up greater and greater. So it's a cascading level of risk across multiple different policy decisions and regulatory decisions at a federal and state level. And this just means that it's going to become very hard to predict how much more expensive it's going to be to insure an asset. And do you mind if I make fun of where I live? I have earthquake risks. It's fire season coming up, so I have that risk. Then I have flood risk because my town where I live, San Semo, it floods quite well. And so, we have so many different levels of risk. Thankfully, I'm not in Malibu because then I would have mudslide risk. But when you add all these risks up and you tally it, the insurance for home insurance will only continue to go up and take a greater share. And if you combine that with healthcare insurance and then taxes on all energy and all other services that we all depend on, water, power, I would say the share of my income, it's doubled in 3.5 years. So is that survivable for most people across society? And the answer is no, it's not. People need to eat. So they're just going to choose not to wash their clothes as much. They're going to choose to never turn on, a power source like air conditioning or heating. So whatever, people are just they're going to have less, and they're going to have to make do with less, and they're going to be having to pay a greater amount of money, which means this is just going to continue to cascade. And from a risk perspective, that just means the insurance market is going to be, they need to have reinsurance. So the reinsurers have to actually underwrite that risk. So I think less and less insurance firms are going to continue to underwrite in these markets, regardless of what they can charge.
A live audience, we're heading somewhat to the home stretch, ballpark about 15 minutes. Y'all haven't been as interactive asking questions in the chat feature. If you're part of the webinar, or sometimes even I could open it up via the social media platforms. So feel free while you have a chance. Again, good luck finding long form or any content with Jim, who's brilliant online, because it basically ain't there. Tom Bilyeu, Chris Williamson, Joe Rogan haven't quite called on Jim yet. But of course, after seeing this, and Tim Ferriss, of course, he's in. I have a question that is built upon news from the last week that arguably may be in full or partially fugazi and not real, but let's assume that it is. It makes a better story, Jim. Are the Venezuelan gangs taking over apartment buildings in Aurora, Colorado, and the Hells Angels attempting to intervene kind of the start of different factions in war on U.S. soil?
I don't know, because I wasn't there, but it does look from the media reporting to be very disconcerting. And I'm thankful I do not live in that town. But is that going to continue to happen? It looks like it's happening more frequently. The data suggests that. So from a data-driven perspective, it looks very disconcerting because it's part of an alarming, you could draw many patterns, and who you want to attribute it to, that's different. But the reality is this is a problem. And if criminal organizations believe that they can do what they're doing, they're just going to continue until that changes. And New York went through this in the 70s, and I happened to be young when I was there, but I remember it very, very clearly. And I was talking about the subject with a friend of mine from Miami, and we both were joking, there's no way that would happen in Miami. It would be dealt with within an hour. And so the question is how large scale can that happen? So obviously you should assume that that can happen anywhere, which should upset many people. And then the question is how do you prove to yourself, regardless of who you are, whether you have a family, whether you have a company and you're worried about your employees, you're worried about your employees and your family, regardless of where you are in that thinking, you have to accept that is now something maybe you never believed would ever happen. It's now happening. So you can't deny, is grave? Oh, it's only going to happen in that state. It's only going to happen in that region. No, you should assume that will continue to happen until it's dealt with appropriately.
No, you kind of hinted at it. Colorado is certainly more of a blue state. To me, the answer, why the hell aren't the police, SWAT, and very simply the National Guard going in there and, let me be a little careful with my choice of words, why don't we go at taking care of business?
Yeah, I don't know. What I would say is all blue states have the opportunity to be the most secure places in the world if they want to. It's just a question of the community and the politics and the belief systems and the individuals that they've hired in the various agencies and the various, whether it's from a district attorney perspective, it really, really is a problem if you continue to let people have access to everything those gangs have access to. So they had access to the border. They came across. They had access to weapon systems. And then they had access to that property. And as a result, they were not stopped anywhere on their journey, as people in California like to say. So it looks like they were able to do what they wanted to do. And that's not something you want that part of society to think is, A, acceptable, and B, should happen everywhere. So it's communities will ultimately vote with money, capital, and resources, and decide whether or not that's acceptable and the community that they choose to live in.
Jim, I could do 3 hours on the next subject, which I'll
Sure.
have to bifurcate into like 2 questions given time concerns. My audience knows I've been active both as an investor and a seeker of the truth and a little bit of a thought leader in my activities and my travels to Silicon Valley and my interviews on things relative to AI, including a brief interview I did this summer, very brief, I'll admit that, but with Ray Kurzweil. You mentioned it actually earlier. We have, if the growth is occurring, doubling 1 point every 08 years, in theory, if that keeps up, in theory, that's 1,000x more compute power in 10 years. We are going from LLMs to better LLMs to better and better LLMs to AI agents to inevitably something pretty close to AGI, then AGI. And you use the word that I wrote about this summer that apparently the family office world is not ready to hear yet, but I was the first in super intelligence. I think if you track the compute power, energy may be an issue. And who knows? Taiwan gets invaded, wars happen. There are things that could go wrong. I think we'll probably hit AGI between 2029 and 31. And within 2 to 10 years after that, we'll have some level of super intelligence. Wow, that is going to change everything. Think about jobs, think about military, think about drones, think about space wars, think about the economy, think about solving fusion energy. I could go utopia, but I don't know. It may initially be a little bit of that, but this could get very, very weird. Very weird. I'm only giving you 2 or 3 minutes on a very complex question, and maybe my members will get more context from you in a private session that we'll do. But if you could share your opinion on my comment, that'd be appreciated.
I think it will happen much faster than everybody realizes.
Wow.
I don't pretend to know. I can only say that if you just look at the data center industry and
Yeah.
everything around the supply chain around data centers, energy, power, grid, access, and it's a megawatt game. I'm just going to bring up a comment that, I don't think is brought up long enough. Superintelligence requires the Tennessee Valley Authority. We all know what the Tennessee Valley Authority was really fantastic at. So you're talking about a national strategy. And what people may not be aware of is nation states are deciding sovereignty is going to be determined by whose superintelligence is more intelligent than the other nation.
And
That's
they
what's
don't
going
have
on.
safeguards.
They don't have safeguards. So here's a great reason for having some, shall we say, part of your wealth and your strategy around returns and family office and preservation and continuity and longevity. Yes, you do want to reside in countries where their commitment to this type of technology is perhaps greater and stronger and more committed than other countries. So Abu Dhabi, fully committed. Dubai, fully committed. The United Arab Emirates understands the stakes. They're all in. And their great energy, at the UAE, look at their energy portfolio. It's phenomenal. So to be applauded, and I think it's fantastic and remarkable. And what they decided to say is, we're going to be the most competitive, most dynamic, and we're going to attract the best talent in the world. And we're going to invest heavily and ahead and faster than anyone else in history. So we want access to the best technology, the best people, and the best teams. And that is why half the valley is in the UAE and KSA on a pretty regular basis, regardless of how hot it is. So everyone's there. So that's one. Two, everyone else is also in the Nordics. Oh, wait a minute. Where's all the mineral energy wealth? Oh, it's in the Arctic. Oh, congratulations. Again, same group of people. China's there, Russia's there, the United States is there. So good news. The peer competitors to the United States are all in. The BRICS plus all in. And so anyone who's not all in, and that means if you're a CEO or board and you're not all in, you will face a really stark, grave choice soon, because one of your competitors will be picked by its favorite nation state and be given access to that level of knowledge and intelligence, be able to apply that to their business model and to steward their capital decisions. I would argue what you're seeing in Japan, you're seeing it right now. 7-Eleven, which we refer to 7-Eleven in the United States, is competing with Circle K. Circle K, look at who owns that company. That company's going all in on Japan. It wants to acquire 7-Eleven. They're brilliant. They're very smart. And by the way, Japanese are equally brilliant. And so you're going to see this transition of generative AI to superintelligence impact all retail in countries like Japan, one of the greatest countries in history. And you're going to see it fundamentally change Japan's economy, and it's not going to take 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. It's happening right now. And I think that's what that speed and the ability to adapt, adaptive, flexible, strategic planning. Most countries and economies are waiting and watching. In Europe, what have they chosen to do? Regulate. It's regulation.
Yeah,
Brussels has chosen to regulate. So how well is Europe going to do in this environment? Not as well as it should or could. And by the way, if you have the best engineers, look at all the remarkable engineering talent. So I'm so proud of Europe. But my goodness gracious, why?
Bureaucracy and a whole bunch of other challenges.
There's
Jim,
nothing.
again, I
Yeah,
do
there you
want to
go.
be
Yeah,
respectful of your time. One more, or maybe two super quick questions.
sure.
But Jim has a lot more to say about AI, AGI, and superintelligence. We both have strong opinions. We're both connected. And there's other questions like in 3 to 5 years, will financial markets be ruled by AI systems? Why don't I say, and I'm making a commitment for Jim that he didn't commit to, but I think I could get him for my members only in a brief 30-minute digital session in October. We'll have Jim back and go into those things that some things we can't even really say more publicly. And that's why being a member and getting an edge and access like this is going to be very important. Jim, it's unfair to you to give you 2 minutes to answer this question, but besides liquidity, what, and maybe something else we didn't cover, what other big risk will family offices face? I guess AI is going to be one in the coming 3 to 5 years.
Governance. And the reason why governance is such an important matter to address is because multi-generational family offices, most family offices are multi-generational. They're going to have completely different approaches to risk, and they may have not seen the levels of risk that many of the more mature, distinguished, and shall I say seasoned family offices and their platforms and teams are. So there are family offices in the United States who have been building some of the most extraordinary platforms ever, just like they are in Europe and in Asia. And those teams have a very strong governance structure around risk and allocation and concentration and liquidity. And those teams have no problem telling you how distinguished they are because they know how much time and energy and resources they put into it. And so that's what I would say in general is governance will be the difference in the next 5 years because many families have very different opinions about risk and allocation and distribution and access to that capital versus preservation or a long-term strategy. And that is a governance challenge. And that is, I think, one of the greatest challenges that almost every family office has to address in addition
Completely
to
agree.
concentration. Yeah.
Final question, and a bit of
Shoot.
an uncomfortable one.
Okay.
BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the big three investment firms, hold significant shareholder rights in many S&P companies, including in important sector industries, military, media, Hollywood, big pharma. I think maybe collectively about 70 trillion. I don't know. Should this concern us?
I think they've done an extraordinary job aggregating capital and creating some of the greatest financial assets in the history of the free world in the West. I defer to the legal talent that's out there. I would just say that you want to make sure that you have a lot of their product and diversification across their product offerings. And if you do, you probably will do well because they are going to be like JP Morgan Chase. They're not allowed to fail. And I don't say that as an expert. I'm just saying that as the more you get efficient at aggregating capital and creating new capital financial products and financial services products, regardless of where your bias is or your focus or interest is, I just think they're going to be very, very important to be extraordinarily knowledgeable about and really understand, all aspects of how do you attribute that trade? How do you prove that you own, that position? And what kind of concentration do you have? And it's the same answer every time. If you only have access to BlackRock product, that's probably not ideal. You want to have a diverse bundle and basket. And I think those are three very, very extraordinary platforms that everyone should leverage.
Excellent. And I'm going to give Jim a chance to effectively close and share his contact info if he desires. And please stay tuned for my close, where I do have a request from the audience. I kind of need your help, not necessarily on membership, although that would be very valuable, on certain guests. And I know I have very prominent people, and I'm very fortunate, the few that I have that watch my videos. But stay tuned. That's coming up in 2 minutes. For now, Jim, if you don't mind, closing commentary, and if you desire, ways that people could learn more about you if they're a family office, an SFO, an MFO, and they want strategic guidance, advice on certain assets or mitigating certain risk. Trust me, Jim is the guy. I'm letting you in on one of my inner thought leaders, one of my secrets, probably something I shouldn't do so publicly, but I am. Jim, I'll give it to you to share your info and a bit of a close if you desire.
Thank you very much, Angelo. What a privilege to be on with you today. And thank you for everything that you've done to help me think more effectively about risk and risk management. I would say my contact information, please go to Angelo and his community and his membership, and that's definitely where you can reach out. Or I am on LinkedIn, and once a quarter, I definitely take a lot of inbounds from people I've never met before, and it would be a privilege to speak with anyone who is running an SFO and is interested in risk management, risk mitigation. And we're just very fortunate in my firm to work with a lot of the leading risk management teams, and we can just recommend some really remarkable people across, whether they're chief investment officers or portfolio managers. We're fortunate to know a lot of really talented people who think very differently. And I would say that my final comment is just continue to diversify the extraordinary talent that's out there. And the more you have access to very, very diverse thinking, I think you'll find your returns will show that they're going a little bit better than they normally would. And from a wealth preservation perspective, that's going to be key because it's going to help you with governance. And I think when you add those together, that should generate greater returns, more consistent returns, and preserve more of your wealth for future generations.
Excellent. And yes, of course, go follow Jim on LinkedIn. He may be a little hard to find, but you'll find him. And potentially, if it's something of value, have an opportunity to reach out. My members could always reach out to me, and Jim is always courteous to my families and my members for he's open to a direct introduction. But again, I don't really want to be overly proactive with it. You gotta take some action, and you gotta let me know. And those that may be listening as a direct family, the head or partner in an MFO or SFO, happy to make the connection simply if you ask. And I do promise more proprietary content and access to Jim and people like Jim, where we do really deep, more concentrated 30-minute dives into one subject and get very open, as well as the next time Jim makes it in New York, would love to host a breakfast for my members impromptu and have him kind of as our special guest. I hope you all enjoyed this. I really, really do enjoy. If nothing else, if I had no watchers, no listeners, I learned so much. It's an opportunity for me, being a curious son of a gun, to hopefully ask some interesting questions and have great guests so I could learn more. I suppose an ask I would have for some of you, I'm fortunate to have some billionaires, some SFOs, some regular folk. It's all good. I come from nothing. I'm humble. I've been lucky for any little bit of successes that I've had. There are certain guests I would love to have on. Sometimes they have PR firms. They're going to look at my platform and say, well, he's not Tom Bilyeu. He's not Chris Williamson. He's not Rogan. He doesn't have, or Tucker. I don't have 5, 10, 15, 20 million followers, but I do ask, I hope, interesting questions. I'm very dedicated to what I do, and I have an extremely targeted audience, including people in the Forbes 400 that are relationships of mine that shockingly enjoy getting my content in my interviews. I would love to have Eric Weinstein on. I think he's brilliant. I would love to interview him long form. I just don't have a way to reach him. I think Whitney Webb is also very interesting. So some of you may have access to some people that could be incredible guests. I would love to be introduced, and I promised them I would have an extremely targeted audience and distribution of effectively the most prominent single family offices in the world. And I am global and I do travel. I even done some interviews around the world. But other than that, what I said earlier, really join what I'm doing. Be a part of it. Be a founding member. Go to angelorobles.com. It's easy. I'm rather very forward with joining and being a founding member and be a part of it. But if you don't, it's okay. I give some interesting content along the way. Follow me on Apple and Spotify, new on Rumble, although very, very new there. And the work, obviously, my more prominent platforms on LinkedIn, on @FamilyOffice on YouTube, and @FamilyOffice TV, also on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed it. I know, again, I'm not always everyone's favorite, but again, my problem with this community is a lack of difficult conversations, sometimes due to ignorance and sometimes due to fear. And I don't want to be that way. If that ends up offending some people and I miss out on some revenues, I guess it is what it is. I don't need 30, 40 to 50 people that actually love me. I need them to respect some of the valuable information and connections and peer to peer that they're going to get by being a part of what I do, and not just a glorified event company having sponsor after sponsor speak and having crap in the room. That's not good quality. And that's not what you really want in a true family office organization that dives into sensitive subjects, does so, I hope, with a level of intellectual rigor and no fear, and the opportunity for you to learn and for me to learn along the way as well. Again, I'm wrong a lot. I look to learn. I don't come at it with, I know everything, because I don't, but I want to be curious and I want to ask the tough questions that I believe effectively no one else in the family office community is doing, partially because they're scared. So on that note, would appreciate your support, have the opportunity to reach out. And again, Jim, thank you so much. It took about 7 years, but thank you so much for being a guest today. I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you all for your time and have a great day. Thank you.
A privilege.